All right, so the slide talks about commercial impracticability. It's easy for me to say. And the idea is that sometimes the contracts parties into for the sale of goods just can't be done anymore. So there's this perfect tender rule, but sometimes that's just not going to work out because it's not possible to tender what the parties originally intended to. And so this is a case about whether this contract is commercially impractical or not. What happened? What were the facts?
This company agreed to sell milk to school district, and all of a sudden the price of milk went up 23 cents or whatever a gallon, and he'd be losing money if he sold it to school at that price. So
right.
Tried to get out of it.
So they entered into contracts with multiple school districts, and between the time of the contract and later on in the year, the price went up 23%. And they said, please let us out of this. We're going to lose a bunch of money, and then if you multiply that by all the school districts we've contracted, we're going to go under. And so they ended up in court, and the court said what?
So sorry.
Right. Too bad, so sad. You contracted, you have to deliver. Now, what was their argument? I mean, because when they go into court, the judge says, remember we were talking about parole evidence rule last time? The court says, well, it's right here. You guys locked in this price. What's the problem? And what was their response?
It's impractical for him to sell it that.
Yeah, Judge, we know what we agreed to. However, I mean, we just got to tell you, we got to introduce some evidence outside this written contract to let you know that neither one of us thought it was possible that the price of milk could go up this much in such a short period of time. Well, what did the court say about that?
They said that it was foreseeable that the price of milk would go up.
It was certainly foreseeable. In fact, it was the first thing on the mind of the school district. If we contract now, we lock in this price, and this is what it's going to cost us. That's what these contracts are about. What's the other way of doing this?
Right in the contract that you might have to change.
Right. Say the price may increase, and it's going to be whatever the price is at the time. Another way to do it is to say, we need milk. You got milk? Yep, we do, but right now it's this price. But instead, as an incentive to contract, they entered into this agreement where it was certainly possible that the price could go up. What could also happen? Right. So, you know, the school district could be in a situation where they're paying more for milk than they need to. And they might go whine into the court saying, gosh, you know, we're a school district and, you know, we're talking about the kids here, and it's costing us more money than it should. And the court should have the same response. So there's a risk that the price might go up, it might go down, and you could contract to take care of that risk. All right. So this was not a situation where the contract was commercially impractical to perform. All right, other exceptions. Once you start accepting partial performance, then you might be prevented from later arguing that the performance wasn't good enough. In other words, if a party ships you goods, but they don't ship them all to you, and you accept them and say you're willing to take more, then you kind of rule out the argument that you rejected them from the beginning. All right, so this kind of expands on one of the objectives from the start of the slides. What obligation does a buyer have during the term of this contract for the sale of goods? Certainly, we already mentioned that they have an obligation to pay for the goods if they're conforming goods. And so when we talk about conforming goods, we talk about them accepting the goods that are delivered by the seller. They can do that by expressly, you know, they can write, you know, sign here, we accept. They could say, yep, these look good to us, or their conduct by taking the goods and not rejecting them can be considered to be enough. So I take the goods, I don't say they're not good enough, but I keep them and I act as if they're mine. How might you act as if goods are yours? What might you do with them?
Use them.
Right, use them, sell them, protect them, insure them. You know, there's all kinds of things you can do that make it appear to anyone else, including the court, that you were accepting the goods. Now, before you accept the goods, you generally have a right to inspect the goods. That's how you find out whether they're conforming or not. Now, probably one of the, question.
Okay. Speaking about inspecting the goods,
Mm-hmm.
Let's say goods come on Friday. Let's say this week coming up.
Right.
When do I have to inspect them? How long?
Right, a reasonable period of time.
That's in that
2
question.
weeks, a month?
Next, if you're going to reject them.
Reasonable.
It could be like a year even, really.
Right. So it may depend on the type of goods. You know, we were talking about this last time.
The eggs.
You know, yeah, the egg example. There are different situations where it's it's easy to determine whether the goods are conforming or not. Other situations where it would be difficult. So the courts refuse to say you have 2 days. They always say you have a reasonable period of time. Well, what is that? That's what judges get paid for, to decide what that is, based on the circumstances and the type of goods we're talking about. So one thing that might come up is some type of pattern. You know, maybe it's between the seller and buyer. You know, the seller has a habit of delivering on Friday, and then the buyer has a habit of the following week or something notifying the seller that the goods are conforming or not.
Would it be, say I deliver them a week early in case there's a problem. He doesn't reject it until the day after delivery date. I have, no time at that point to remedy the situation.
Right, this is something that comes into play is you had an obligation to inspect and accept the goods, but you delay communicating that to the seller, and the seller no longer has an opportunity to cure. So that can come into play in a court case where they say, look, we delivered them to you early, and if we had known, we could have cured it. So we should get time from the time that you did notify us to cure it. So that's the way it works out. I mean, we've got all these rules, but, in the end, the court's going to look at what was reasonable under the circumstances. Another one that comes up is CODs. At my house, when the UPS person, did somebody in here work at UPS? Yeah. When the UPS person shows up, they do the knock and drop, right? I hear something, and I'm like, what was that? And about the time I figured out what it is, I hear, and the truck's driving away, right? I don't ever talk to the delivery person. So occasionally, though, there might be some shipping terms where I need to sign for it, or I need to pay for it, right? So it's possible to get something shipped, and it has to be paid for at the point of delivery at the buyer, right? And so, has anybody ever had this happen? COD? Okay. Does the delivery driver stand there and say, okay, inspect it, let me know if you accept or reject these goods or not?
Sign here.
Right, they don't care. They're out of there, right? So, while we typically get to inspect and then reject, in this situation, in COD situations, we take the goods, but then later we still have an opportunity to inspect and reject. Right? It's just the shipper has nothing to do with it. Right? All right. Anticipatory repudiation. We talked about this a little bit in Business Law 1. In contracts for the sale of goods, how might a breach occur?
They didn't perform.
Right, they didn't perform. That's how contracts are breaches. One of the parties doesn't perform, which might be what? What were the two biggies that I said that lead to breach of contract, lead to non-performance?
Don't deliver them, don't pay for them.
You don't get what you asked for, right? They're not conforming in some way, or the buyer doesn't meet their obligations. They don't take it or pay for it. Right? So, in this situation, anticipatory repudiation, we're talking about before that breach occurs. So what do I mean? Like it says up there on the first bullet, prior to the time for performance, which may be, for example, delivery of the goods to the buyer, one of the parties communicates to the other party that they're not going to perform. Now, in reality, what might that sound like? Hey, seller, you can deliver them, but when they get here, we're not paying for them. We don't want them anymore, right? And the seller's saying, well, nice time to tell us they're already on the way. Right? Or the seller's shipping, and the seller learns that the buyer is insolvent and incapable of paying. Now, the time for performance hasn't come. The goods haven't arrived. The buyer doesn't have an obligation to pay for them yet. So, anticipatory repudiation means you think there's going to be a breach. Like if I'm the seller and I'm shipping goods and the buyer is shut down and closed, don't I think something's going to happen? It's not going to be good? So, this idea is, well, before I go through the expense and time to ship something, if I think the other party is not going to perform, maybe I can stop. Because if you didn't have this rule, and I thought the other party was not going to perform, and so I held on to the goods and didn't deliver them, now what have I just done? Breached the contract. I failed to perform. Now the other party gets to say, well, look, we didn't pay, and it looks like we breached, but the reason we didn't pay is because we didn't get what we asked for. So, under anticipatory repudiation, if we think the other party is going to breach, what should we do? Don't ship. Careful. If we don't ship, like we said, we might be in breach.
You can treat it as a
Not yet. We've got to do something before we just treat.
Assurance.
Yes, we ask them for reasonable assurance, which translate, what would that be? Hey, we noticed you haven't been paying your bills lately. If we ship you this stuff, are you going to pay for it? That would be a reasonable assurance, right? Or, hey, we notice things are kind of dark over there. Is there going to be anybody there when we ship this stuff? And if the other party says, yep, you got us, we're broke, we're not going to be able to pay for this, then you can treat it as what? A breach. It's not a breach yet because the time for performance hasn't come, but you can treat it as a breach because the other side hasn't given you reasonable assurance. Or you could wait and see what happens. So you contact the other party and you say, you know what, it looks like you're behind and you're not going to make payment on this. We're thinking we're going to withhold the goods. And the other party says, oh no, we're good for it. Now what do you have to do? Ship them the goods. Now if you ship them the goods because they told you that they're good to go and they're not, then you can bring that up in a lawsuit that you demanded adequate assurances from them and they said, oh yeah, no problem, send them our way.
What if they applied for bankruptcy right after that?
Right, and then the question is, did they act in good faith? And good faith, as we said, is required in any of these contracts, even if we don't say it. So they knew that they were going to do it. Now, why? If you're going to declare bankruptcy and the seller is going to ship you stuff and you know you're not going to pay for it, then why would you not let the seller know that?
You're still
Tend to rip them off.
hoping you don't have to.
all those things, right? It's possible that for some reason you're living in a fantasy world. You somehow haven't, it hasn't totally hit you that you've got some problems here, and you're going to go into bankruptcy and you're not going to be able to pay for it. Or you might want to convince somebody that you have assets that you really don't have, right? Or you want to get the goods, do something with them, so you can make money and not have it be, So there's all kinds of fraud that might be involved too. All right. So the important part about this is if you don't get adequate assurances from the other party, then you can treat it like a breach even though the time for performance hasn't arrived. And that includes suspending your own performance. So like in a buyer situation, when they learn the seller's not going to be in time or not going to ship what they asked for, then what kind of performance would they be making, the buyer? They might be paying for something they're not going to get. So being able to suspend your performance may mean not sending money to somebody who may use the money and not give you the goods.
But you're saying if you could contact them and say, oh yeah, we're going to ship you the goods, that you have to pay it back.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I have something.
Well, I mean, look at it from the other way. Maybe they genuinely are not going to breach the contract. And so when you ask, are you really going to ship? You said you're going to ship. They haven't breached the contract yet. Now you can get into question as whether at the time they knew whether they're going to breach or not. I mean, if they're out of business, they've got no employees, and they're telling you, oh yeah, we'll get it to you, and something's up. It's kind of a weird tech example. We were talking about technology stuff last week, but there's this company that came out with these Mac clones with Leopard installed on them, the new operating system, and it's a violation of the Apple licensing agreement to do this. So they started up business, put out a website, and are taking orders for these computers from people when it's very likely that Apple will slaughter them as a result of doing this. So now you're a buyer, and if you went to this website and you've ordered one of these computers, what's one of the first questions you have? The time for performance hasn't come, and it's not the delivery date for the computer, but what's the question you have in your mind? Are they really going to be able to deliver what they're promising to deliver, right? So you ask them, oh yeah, we're good. Nobody's suing us yet. We're making them. Right? Well, the press picked up the story and decided to do their own little investigation. And the first time they looked up the address of this company, it was in somebody's house. Then the next time they looked up the address, like the same day, it had moved somewhere else. And like within 24 hours, it was in the third location. So now people are going, well, even though you said that you're ongoing concern and you're going to be able to deliver these things, something's up, because people don't move their business around that much in that short period of time. And they explained, a number of things, like, well, there was such demand that we had to go to this new location, and yada yada. So we'll see how that works out. It'll be interesting to find out if they get sued or if they ever deliver anything. All right, so let's go ahead and say that the buyer has breached the contract in some way. They failed to perform. So if that's the situation, what remedies does the seller have? And remember, last time I told you what would affect the remedies that the seller can get in our discussion of delivery of goods. Wouldn't it matter where the goods are at as to which remedies the seller can use? Remember, yesterday I said if the seller has possession of the goods, then there's different remedies they can use versus if they no longer have them. Right? So that's the way the chapter kind of breaks it out and the slides break it out. If the goods are still with the seller, then the seller has a right to do those things. Just keep the goods, cancel the contract. Fine, you're not going to pay, you're not going to take delivery, will just say no more contract. Or could say, we still have a contract, but we're going to withhold the goods until you pay for them. Or could say, we're going to treat this as a breach and sell them to someone else. Remember we were talking about that last time? If you sell them to someone else, what might happen? You might get more or less than you were contracting them for. And, you know, it mentions incidental damage. If you incur some other costs associated with reselling the goods or disposing of the goods, then you can go back against the original buyer for that. You could also say, look, we can't get rid of these goods. We made them for you. They're special for you. You either take the goods and pay for it, or we're going to sue you for what you said you're going to pay for them. Or the last remedy up there, recover damages that result from the breach, right? Which is the difference between the price you contracted for and what you actually might sell them to someone else, or what you're out of pocket. Right? So quite a few different remedies if you still got the goods. Now, as you look at those goods, or those remedies, can you have all of them at the same time? No. Right? If you decide to hold on to the goods to resell them to someone else, you can't get full damages from the buyer, right? Because you'd get double recovery in that situation. So,
But you can get the difference.
right. So if you end up holding on to the goods, resell them to someone else, and you have incidental damages, you could get the money from reselling the goods and damages for what it cost you to do that. Damages sometimes, though, might be zero. I mean, suppose you sell them to someone else at a profit over what you're going to sell them to the first party. And incidental damages are nil, right? So you may not be out much, you might have actually gained from it. All right, so that's when the goods haven't went anywhere yet. Now the goods are moving. They've left the seller, but they're not to the buyer yet. And one of the typical scenarios is, as the goods are in transit, the buyer has indicated that they're not going to perform, or the seller finds out that the buyer can't perform. If that's the case, the seller has a right to say, hey carrier, don't deliver these goods, and cancel the contract. If they can get the goods back from transit, then they could resell them and they could sue to recover any deficiency. Right? So as you look at this list and the last list, they look a lot alike, but there are some remedies that aren't there. Basically, what remedy is missing? What's the big one? Keeping the goods, right? I mean, if they're in transit and you can't get them back soon enough, then that's just not an option for you. You may be stuck with just damages. What happens if something happens to the goods? I mean, think about that scenario. You're fulfilling your obligations as a seller, they're in transit, the buyer's not going to take them, and something happens to them. Who has the risk of loss?
So it depends if it's a delivery or a...
No.
The buyer is in breach.
That's right. Which, back to what we said last time, if the buyer's in breach, these are seller's remedies in transit, then the buyer has the risk of loss. Because they breached the contract. If, you know, the risk of loss wouldn't have technically transferred yet, it just did. Now, how's that in reality? I mean, it's like the truck's driving down the road or something, and all of a sudden you get a phone call. I'm not going to pay. I'm not going to take delivery. You know, not sure how that timing all works out, but technically that's what happens.
Kind of go back to the point here that the buyer is insolvent.
Yes. You know, how is the seller going to find that out?
Exactly.
Right?
You're going to call the guy and he's going to go, oh yeah, I'll make Yeah, I'll pay you.
Right? Typically, you're not going to ship something to somebody if you know they're insolvent. But it's possible that you might not find out until it's in transit. Because, I mean, right now I'm describing situations where in transit it's in the back of a truck and it's not far from the seller to the buyer. But this could be a period of time, right? It goes here, it sits here, then it gets shipped there, and then it finally arrives at the buyer. So at some point, it's in transit, it's sitting somewhere possibly, and at that point, buyer says, look, we're not going to be able to pay for these. So those scenarios can come up. Not as often as these other ones, but we need a remedy in case that does happen. Oops. So now we get the goods have left the seller, have been in transit, and now they're in the buyer's possession. At this point, our remedies go down, right? Because now we don't have control over the goods. It says a right to reclaim the goods as long as we don't breach the peace. I mean, we could go and say, we want our stuff back, you're not paying for it. And if the seller or the buyer cooperates, that's fine, that's a remedy. But if they are claiming that the goods are theirs now, they've accepted them, then that may not be a remedy for us. They won't let us have them back. If so, then at this point now we can sue for the purchase price. Or, if they paid part of it, then whatever's due. So generally, the remedies of the seller vary depending on where the goods are at. So remedies of the buyer, if we're talking about the remedies of the buyer, we're talking about breach of the seller. And again, the seller is going to breach the contract by not delivering what the buyer asked for, or delivering something that's defective or not non-conforming. So when might a seller breach? Well, one of the first ways the seller might breach is not delivering at all. So when you think about the flip side of this, we're talking about seller's remedies. Here they're holding on to goods, right, because they still have them. And now the buyer is saying, no, you breached the contract because you're holding on to goods that you're supposed to be delivering. Right? So it's not always just clear-cut, buyer breached, these are the seller's remedies. It might be both parties are arguing the other party breached the contract, and while the seller thinks they're holding on to goods because the buyer's breaching, the buyer's saying, look, we're not paying you because you're in breach, because you're holding our goods, we're not getting them. So the buyer would say, since you refuse to deliver these goods, this is what we're going to do. We're going to say, forget it. We don't have a contract with you then, because our contract is to get these goods. We need these goods. You won't deliver. We don't want a contract with you. Or recover the goods. Just like I said, the seller could go to the buyer and get the goods back. The buyer might go and say, look, you're supposed to deliver them to us. You're not, but we still need them. We're here to get them from you. The buyer could go to the court and say, look, we want specific performance. We want to obtain an order from the court that says you will deliver what you promised to deliver. Instead, the buyer could cover. Cover means, I'm not getting it from you, I got to go get it somewhere else. So like the example I was giving you, the refrigerators for the apartment complex. If I'm not getting those refrigerators from you, they're freely available somewhere else. I'm going to go somewhere else and get them because I have to cover my situation. In fact, the law says I'm obligated to reduce my damages if I can, so I'm not just going to sit there without renting apartments. I'm going to get refrigerators put in them, but then I'm coming back after you because it costs me more to get these refrigerators. Pretty noisy out there today. Or recover damages for the breach of the contract. We will. All right. So, if the seller delivers non-conforming goods, so instead of the seller holding on to it, the seller ships them, but when the buyer gets it, they're not. And this should look familiar to you, right? Buyer gets non-conforming goods. What are the buyer's options? Say, look, you didn't give us what we asked for. We're rejecting them. Yeah, we accepted them, but now upon closer examination, within a reasonable period of time, we find out they're not what we asked for, they're defective, quantity is missing, whatever, we revoke our acceptance. Or we're going to keep them because we need them, but we want the difference between what you should have delivered and what you actually delivered. So you said you were going to give us 100 refrigerators, but you gave us 75 refrigerators were good, 25 that had cracks, dents, whatever in them. All right, so we got all these remedies by both of these parties, depending on where the goods are at, and that's what the UCC says. However, remember from the very start of our discussion about the UCC, we could by contract limit what's available for us. So the parties could agree to limit their remedies. Now, in reality, what does that mean?
It's in the contract, what would happen if there was a breach.
Right.
Then put it in.
And it might be just one thing, right? So we have this laundry list of things that the seller could get if the buyer breaches, but we could contractually say, if you don't get what you asked for, your remedy is limited to just this. Or we could come up with even more remedies. So we could say, this is what the UCC says we're entitled to, but we're going to come up with this other remedy. Which means, for example, you don't deliver by the date you promised to deliver. It's a little sound effect, never heard anybody. Then we want additional damages. Right? Not actual damages from the breach, but liquidated damages. We, on top of what you're going to pay us, we want you to pay more. And we could also say that you were limited to the actual amount of damages, any damages that are a consequence of that breach, storage, whatever it is, you're not going to get that. Right? So the parties can contractually agree to limit the remedies. And then lastly, under the UCC, remember I said last class that the statute of limitations still exists, the statute of frauds still exists. The UCC doesn't do away with those things. Sometimes it changes the number of years. If there's a contract for the sale of goods, it's a contract under the statute of limitations. And the UCC says, from the point of injury, you got 4 years to commence an action. What does injury mean, right? Because typically you think injury is you hurt yourself, right? What does injury mean here?
The loss you incurred in
Right.
the breach.
So you're out money, you're out refrigerators, whatever it is. As soon as that happens, then you better sue somebody within 4 years or you're out of luck. And once you're harmed, you need to let the other party know that you are. So you don't conceal that for a period of time, so you have a longer period to sue. All right, that's a quick review of the concepts from Chapter 12. Questions about Chapter 11 or 12 before we switch into your time for the group activity? You guys are pretty quiet today. Just because this is all crystal clear, right? No problem. All right. Well then, in that case, under assignments week 2, last assignment down there is the group activity. If you got your laptop up and running, go ahead and pull it and open it up. The rest of the time is yours as a group to figure out how you're going to approach this, work on these questions. Hopefully by the time you leave today you've got answers. So for next class all you're doing is preparing to make your presentation Right? I find that people who wait and don't answer these questions until the morning of the group activity don't do so well. Alrighty. Rest of the time is yours.